Morning, 11 July 1943, Gela Plain, Sicily. Dust hangs over a long column of German armor as engines thrum and tracks grind toward the beaches. Without warning, geysers of earth leap among the lead vehicles, and a sharp metallic roar rolls ashore from the unseen horizon. This is the story of how naval guns shattered a textbook armored counterattack and sealed the fate of a beachhead before noon. If you want more battlefield moments where decisions and steel decide an hour, subscribe and stay with me through the blast radius. The invasion had started the previous day under a chaotic sky and confused surf. Elements of the U.S. 7th Army had forced a foothold near Gela, with the 1st Infantry Division ashore and Rangers holding key ground. Supplies piled on open sand, landing craft came and went in the swell, and tanks and artillery were trickling in. Across the island, Albert Kesselring weighed a familiar doctrinal window. Amphibious landings were fragile at dawn on day 2, and a fast armored blow to the crowded beaches promised to roll the intruders back into the sea. The order went out for a hard thrust from the rebuilt Hermann Göring Division, pushing across the open plain. Paul Conrath, commanding that division, drove to gather his mobile elements and link up with Italian infantry from Divisione Livorno. The plan was simple by design. Mass on good ground, strike before the Americans organized, and exploit the panic of a shoreline under pressure. The terrain favored momentum and shock. Under Terry de la Mesa Allen, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division wrestled with the usual knots of an amphibious morning. Communications lagged, battalions were still sorting out, and many heavy weapons had not yet reached the line. Rangers under William O. Darby guarded Gela and nearby airfields, buying time with rifles, machine guns, and fieldcraft. Everyone understood the stakes. A well-aimed counterattack had erased beachheads before. This one aimed to do the same, while the Americans balanced on a narrow platform of sand and luck. The Americans had planned for this moment with a hard lesson learned in the Mediterranean. Naval gunfire did not simply exist offshore, it had been woven into the ground fight as mobile heavy artillery. Shore fire control parties, small teams with radios, binoculars, maps, and training, waited near forward units to turn ships into batteries on call. Those teams worked a precise process. An observer identified a target, estimated range and direction, and sent a concise fire request to a specific ship or a control net. Information flowed through standardized formats: grid location, target description, method of engagement, and adjustment plan. Clear words cut through noise and fear. On the receiving end, a cruiser or a destroyer converted those words into bearing, range, and powder. Fire control crews used directors, plots, and experienced judgment to lay their guns. The first salvo might be a bracket, set to land beyond and short to frame the target, then adjusted by the observer until impacts walked onto the column. USS Boise and USS Savannah, both Brooklyn-class light cruisers offshore of Gela, carried 15 6-inch guns apiece. Those guns fired shells far heavier and faster than field pieces, and they could sustain high rates of fire without burning out quickly. A single full broadside delivered the mass of an artillery battalion in seconds. Destroyers with 5-inch guns formed the quick hands of the screen. They responded rapidly, corrected fast, and were willing to edge closer to shore if the geometry demanded it. Each ship had trained for shore fire, building habits for deflection, drift, and the strange physics of shooting from a moving, rolling platform at targets on land. The combination created depth and flexibility. Cruisers reached deep and pounded the plain, breaking up concentration and killing engines, while destroyers stitched at edges and covered flanks. Ammunition loads, chosen before the landing, were stocked heavy with high explosive and fuses tuned for fragmentation and blast against soft-skinned vehicles and troops. A key strength was mobility. A ship could slide miles along the coast to change the angle of attack while still firing, presenting unpredictable azimuths to targets inland. Ground batteries could be shelled or overrun. Ships could not be flanked by tanks, and their magazines held mountains of ammunition moved by an industrial lifeline. Signal discipline and training made the whole thing work. Shore parties rehearsed with map boards and prearranged targets, building mental geometry for how a salvo would land relative to the crest lines and roads on the Gela Plain. They knew how to talk a ship onto a moving target under stress and when to switch to another battery mid-mission. German doctrine relied on speed, punch, and pressure. Heavy tanks, including Tigers, provided the spearhead, trusting frontal immunity to open lanes at range while lighter vehicles followed. On open ground, that logic held, until something heavier and more distant pushed back. The counterattack faced limits from the start. Luftwaffe support was thin, and coordinating with Italian units under fire proved difficult. Dust from the plain gave away movement and muddied optics, forcing commanders to rely on radio and intuition. Artillery on the German side struggled for reach against targets at sea. Even if a spotting round found water, the warships lay outside practical range. That forced everything into the kill zone inland, where crews had to survive volume fire directed by eyes they could not spot. Within the U.S. chain, decisions flowed with a bias for speed. The beachhead commander's authority empowered naval gunfire to shoot aggressively without bureaucratic delay. The risk of short rounds existed, but the cost of holding back was higher. Radios tied ground and sea into one nervous system. A single shore team could request one ship to cease fire, pass a correction to another, and keep a moving screen of impacts in front of friendly lines. Safeties, like minimum offset distances and danger close calls, were used, but the reality of a collapsing flank sometimes meant accepting razor-thin margins. Ammunition choice mattered. High explosive with instant fuses sprayed steel, shredded soft vehicles, and stunned crews in open hatches. Delayed fuses cracked open buildings and splintered orchards into lethal rain. Against armor, direct penetration was rare with these calibers, but a near miss could tear tracks, blow road wheels, and ignite fuel and ammunition. Even a tank that remained intact could be blinded. Splinters smashed sights and radios, concussions popped sanity and eardrums, and crews packed under armor began to lose situational awareness. Mobility kills mounted, and the momentum of the column slowed. Meanwhile, infantry crowding behind the tanks lost confidence. Trucks and half-tracks caught in open ground were torn apart. Medical aid was overwhelmed by the tempo of explosions, and platoons scattered to ditches and fissures in the dirt. Command and control were fragile under that kind of blow. An antenna clipped by a splinter severed a company's brain. A knocked-out command vehicle forced changes in direction that folded units back into each other. Every minute under that fire harvested initiative. Back on the ships, procedures protected the speed of engagement. Magazines fed hoists, hoists fed shells and powder to turrets, and gun teams worked to a drumbeat of commands that had been drilled for years. The director officers traced their lines to invisible points on land and took pride in the invisible geometry linking deck to desert. The philosophy was simple. Build a system that could be summoned on a radio, survive counterfire, and throw crushing weight onto coordinates faster than the enemy could adapt. It rewarded those who knew how to describe a target and punished those who tried to survive in the open. Some adjustments were brutal but effective. Observers learned to walk a line of bursts across a road like a curtain, then swing the net 30 degrees to catch those who swerved. Ships learned the rhythm of correction from ground voices and began to read their patterns, anticipating the next call. On the Gela side of the lines, units improvised a lattice under threat. Rangers set up roadblocks with mines and captured guns, calling in naval fire when wheels churned toward them. The 1st Infantry Division oriented by regiment, with regimental commanders slotting attached weapons where the pressure threatened to break through. By mid-morning, the geometry of the plain had become a firing range controlled from sea. German armored points that had seemed unstoppable found themselves pinned against invisible brackets of fire. Every attempt to reform drew a fresh series of splashes. In the open, crews began to sense the pattern and tried to thread through it. That's when the observers adjusted to lead the targets, moving the mean point of impact to where the column would be in 40 seconds, not where it stood. The burst pattern marched ahead of the dust plumes. A break-in effort developed toward a low ridge that shielded part of the route. Several heavy vehicles edged hulls up to shoot, trusting the ground to mask them from distant eyes. The first salvo landed short, throwing brown fountains into the slope. Then the second walked over the crest and hammered the reverse side where engines idled. A fuel truck took a near hit. In an instant, a boiling cloud of black fractured the road and blinded drivers. Following vehicles slewed, some crawled off into the field, and a chain of horns and shouted orders added to the noise. To the east, a packet of half-tracks tried to loop around through a shallow draw. A destroyer, warned by a shore party looking straight into the cut, hauled closer to the line and stitched the draw with 5-inch high explosive. It looked like the ground itself was spitting fire. In the town, Rangers used alleys and corners as cover to call corrections. A mortar team fired smoke to mark a flank, and a cruiser zeroed on that marker once the wind carried it along the right edge. It wasn't elegant, but the smoke's drift told the director how to offset against the breeze. Out at sea, Boise's gun captains counted their cycles, keeping barrels cool enough to hold accuracy. Savannah coordinated with destroyers to ensure sectors overlapped rather than duplicated, each ship holding a slice of the plain like zones on a grid. The radio net crackled with short orders, call signs, and corrections. A heavy tank tried to bound forward, angling to place its frontal armor toward the coast while bringing its gun to bear on a suspected American strongpoint. The next salvo bracketed it. One round smashed near the right track and lifted the hull off the ground, slamming it back with a cracked wheel and a sprung tensioner. The crew fought the machine back into motion, but speed was gone. Infantry behind the tank swarmed past in greedy clumps, then dropped as shrapnel from a follow-up burst scythed through the formation. Leaders tried to wave them forward, but eyes kept sliding back to the horizon. Another cluster of vehicles bunched near a crossroads tree line, using shade as if it could stop steel. The observer keyed his handset and gave a short, precise amend. Moments later, a pattern of explosions walked the edge of the trees, trimming branches and ripping the thin protection to pieces. Efforts to counter the unseen guns went nowhere. Battery commanders called for counter-battery, but their rounds fell far short of the gray shapes at the edge of the world. Pilots were scarce, and those who arrived had no coordinated slot in the chaos. At the same time, friendly fire risks rose as the fight compressed. A company of American infantry pushed out to extend the line and nearly ran into a barrage. The shore party cut Boise's fire, shifted the mission to a destroyer with a better angle, and kept the curtain moving away from the friendlies. Behind the beach, logistics teams hauled ammunition off landing craft and pushed it forward despite shells whistling inland. Commanders on the sandbar measured the landing tempo in minutes saved, and pallets moved before the next crisis call. Every minute bought by naval fire allowed another gun to come ashore. By late morning, momentum bled out of the German attack. Individual tanks still fired and moved, but the coordinated push had come apart into fragments. Vehicles withdrew in zigzags, pursued by spotting rounds nudging them toward exit routes the observers could see. Conrath's staffs tried to regain control and mount another punch, but the math had changed. Radios were dead, some roads were cratered, and units were fighting by memory under a hanging haze of dust and smoke. The attack clock had run out. Kesselring, receiving reports, recognized the pattern he had dreaded. The window had closed not because of beachhead defenses alone, but because the Americans had brought a fortress afloat to guard the vulnerable hour. Speed and courage had met measured fire that could not be rushed or flanked. On the waterline, Rangers and infantry watched the column shrink with a mix of relief and disbelief. It was not a duel. It was a floodgate opened and closed by coordinates. Noise became ringing silence broken by individual shots and the rattle of tracks pulling away. As the last salvos fell, beach parties exhaled and went back to moving crates and laying wire. The ships stood ready to reopen fire at any hint of a renewed surge. Their barrels were blackened, their crews sweaty and hoarse, but the system worked without drama. The day was not without cost at sea. A plane scored a hit elsewhere on the screen, and some destroyers took splashes nearby. But off Gela, the cruisers that mattered had done their work decisively, their silhouettes steady against the horizon. Along the edges of the plain, small fires burned where vehicles had cooked off. Medics worked among survivors, pulling men from ditch edges and behind wheels. A few crews limped damaged armor toward safer ground, tracks squealing and rollers grinding. The battlefield slowly resolved into a map of blown positions and stalled plans. American units marked cleared pockets and counted the next steps inland. The shoreline no longer looked like a trap. It looked like a hinge. In the immediate wake, the German thrust recoiled from the beachhead and tried to consolidate on defensible lines beyond the plain. Records vary on the exact number of Tigers engaged. U.S. commanders walked the sand with radios still on, confirming ceasefires and ordering fresh combat outposts to watch the approaches. Naval officers logged expenditure, tracked barrel wear, and prepared to replenish ammunition from the magazines of arriving ships. On shore, Ranger patrols pushed into the battered ground to collect prisoners and confirm that no hidden pockets were assembling for another push. This mattered because it removed the most dangerous threat within hours and allowed the American bridge of boats, men, and machines to widen into a secure lodgment. It also demonstrated in the clearest terms that sea-based firepower could outpace and outlast an armored dash on land. After Sicily, naval gunfire procedures were refined and exported to the next beaches. Shore parties received more training and better radios, and ships balanced ammunition loads with the expectation of repeated land fights close to the surf. The lesson was spare and concrete. Integrate your fires and your logistics, and the battlefield bends around your system. Courage matters, but a coordinated network that can move, see, and hit quickly matters more. For more hard-edged battles where doctrine collides with reality, subscribe for the next episode.